Welcome back to the 30th Annual HACR Symposium. Now, please offer a warm round of applause to HACR President and CEO, Sid Wilson.
All right. Buenos días, mi gente. All right. How was the previous session with our Chief Diversity Officers? Wasn't that amazing? Yeah, absolutely. We're so excited for these, and hope you've been having a great session. And to all of us that are watching virtually, also bienvenidos. Good morning, good afternoon. If you're on the East Coast, it's 1 o'clock Eastern time over there. So we're now ready for our session that really goes to the core of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility. This is our session about our Corporate Inclusion Index. HACR has been having a corporate accountability component of what we've been doing since our inception. And since 2009, this has been a survey process that we have been doing, and we're so thankful for many of the companies that have participated in our HACR Corporate Inclusion Index over the years. I do want to give a very special acknowledgement because of the fact that this year's Corporate Inclusion Index, now in its third year under this new format, was the brainchild of our former Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, who's now the Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, La Doctora, Dr. Lisette Garcia. Please give Dr. Lisette Garcia an applause. So thank you, Doctora Garcia. And so this is something that we continue to do each and every year, and we're so thankful for all of our company participants. Just also some minor housekeeping, something we encourage you to make sure that continue to share on social media, and remember that prize that's coming in later today? So, our secret, I know, right? So this is great. So let's get started. So to moderate today's panel, you just saw her just moments ago, but please welcome back to the stage our HACR Senior Vice President of Operations and Interim Director of our HACR Research Institute, Sylvia Perez-Cash. Thank you.
Thank you, Sid. Thank you. Wonderful. So we have a lot to cover today. We have our panel and our panelists who are representing two companies who took our CII, our Corporate Inclusion Index surveys this year. Before we get to them, though, I'm going to try to summarize some of the high-level insights that we derived from this year's data. So if you could bear with me. So, did it change? There we go. The Corporate Inclusion Index is run by a small but mighty team. I just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge my colleague here, Naida Rivera Hernandez, who joins us. She is here from Puerto Rico today, but she has a ton of experience. She used to run the Kid Counts program in Puerto Rico, if any of you are familiar with that, and has just been a tremendous asset. As Sid referenced, that this report is the baby, the brainchild. You know, I've been honored to step into her shoes of Miss Lisette, Dr. Lisette Garcia. But there was also a team of folks who I've handed it over to me as well. So many of you may know Roxana Vergara or Eric Lopez, both of whom are really integral to this report and, of course, every report prior to, and a lot of the data that we'll be drawing on as we do our year-to-year comparisons. So please, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge their leadership in this as well. So much about our CII is about compiling and tracking industry data. And it's also about offering practical tools for you, for our company. So while we want this data, we heard a lot about transparency in our previous panel. We need this data to understand what's happening. It's a two-way relationship. We also want that the effort that you put in, the stakeholders that you convene, the work that goes into these benchmarking surveys to have a direct ROI for our advocacy and your ability to champion the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion for Hispanics specifically in your companies. And so with that, we really have designed this survey with you in mind, offering tools and roadmaps to help you identify where the next steps are for your company. Needless to say, but I must say it, especially from this stage, if your company is not taking our CII already, let's change that next year, right? It's an annual survey. It will open in January of 2023, and that's plenty of time to prep your teams and the folks that you need to be involved to be successful in this endeavor. So if that's something that is of interest to you now or after this presentation, just reach out to me and let me know. I'll be happy to connect you to the process. Let's see. Oh, skipping ahead. I think the remote is a little off. Well, I will jump there. So I also wanted to share, I can't tell which slide this is on, excuse me. I can't see. Oh, there we go. Okay. I also wanted to share that, as Sid mentioned, we did disrupt our survey in 2020, just like the rest of the country, the rest of the world was disrupted. And we did this very intentionally. Our Corporate Inclusion Index has been a report that we've been using since 2009. And a lot of the data analysis that we use is based off of those comparisons and those trends that we were able to derive over the course of that time. The disruption of 2020 was so severe that we just did not think it was fair, frankly, to use that data and track progress when everything had kind of been thrown up in the air. And so we didn't. Now we're moving forward from that point, and in this year, we have a very interesting set of 3 years to look back on post-2020. And in fairness, it's not quite post. Our 2020 Corporate Index report is reflecting 2019 data, which is your pre-pandemic, that old normal, that history that we kind of vaguely remember, right? That's the way we used to do things. Our data offers a really good look at that and what Hispanics were experiencing in corporate America at that time. 2020 data, which came out in our 2021 report, really shows you what the disruption was to our diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and how those disruptions affected Hispanics in our companies. And then this year's report is beginning to show and highlight what possible areas of renormalization look like. How are companies recalibrating themselves to reestablish some sense of normalcy, which we also spoke about earlier. This is really important because how we do this matters, and we're going to get into that a bit today. Now, who took our survey? This would not be possible without the participation of our companies. I'm delighted to share that we had 82 participants take our survey this year, different companies. I am surprised to also have to share that that represents an 11% decrease in participation from last year, and further decrease if you count 2 years ago. To be honest, which I always am, I have lots of theories about why this decrease has occurred, but mostly it's because I think it reflects the lack of integration of DE&I as an operating strategy in companies. And I say this, with all candor. DE&I cannot be a program. When you have a program, you have a program manager. And when program managers leave because of hiring disruptions, because of childcare needs that have been disruptive, because of healthcare emergencies that have been disruptive, all the things that we've experienced in the last 3 years, well, if it's just a program, they take all that knowledge with them. All that information transfer isn't embedded as a way of work. When it is an operating strategy, when it's integrated into your business strategies, loss of knowledge transfer is not going to happen. That would put the whole company at risk, right? And so we experienced a lot of that when I was engaging with companies this year. Really, people being honest, but also being reflective that, we don't know how to do that this year. We don't have the capacity to do this year, right? And so I want to just sit on that for a little bit and encourage you to think about where your companies stand and how you can make sure that that capacity and that knowledge is there in 2023 so that you too can participate. all that is also to acknowledge that I do appreciate each and every company that did take our survey, regardless of your rating. Thank you so much for your effort. Thank you so much for your transparency. Thank you so much for your partnership and commitment. You cannot know if you're successful if you are not tracking your outcomes. You cannot know what you're doing if you're not aware of your best practices. The CII helps you do that, and we're your partners in that effort. So let's see. I think the battery must be low. So, what do we know about this year's report? The theme of this year's report is about that recalibration process, that renormalization process. And there's a quote that really stands out to me, mostly because I was part of writing it, but also because I think it captures the message of the report, right? Which is, in the same way that leaders needed resolve and resiliency to get through the challenges of the last 3 years, advocates and allies will need that same resolve to reshape DE&I practices to fit our new reality and restart the right way. Restarting the right way is the opportunity that we have. It's the imperative that we have. So I'm going to try to fly by, actually, the rest of these slides, because I realize some of the technical stuff is slowing me down. So our survey is organized into 4 pillars, which we know. We've been looking at the loop over the last couple of days. We look at Hispanic inclusion across employment. We look at Hispanic inclusion across procurement, philanthropy, and governance. The CII also does a very specific look into the experience of Latinas as an intersectional space and experience that does not get enough attention. And so we try to spotlight that. In the areas in employment, even though the sample overall received 4 out of 5 possible stars for employment, there is really some startling and disappointing news that I think is important to highlight. Hispanic employees in the corporate workforce declined by 0.8% since 2020. 0.8%. And while that may not seem like a big drop, it is actually the second largest drop in Hispanic employment outcomes reported in our CII since 2019. So something is happening there. All right, this decline in representation is mirrored in internship programs as well. And we know that internship programs are a key part of our employment pipeline. They are a key part in diversifying that pipeline, building the social capital needed to be successful in our companies. And if we're not in the basic core of some of these pipelines, we're not being hired in the employment, we're not being hired, period. It's something that we really need to look forward, we need to pay attention to. Additionally, when we think about the importance of sponsorship and mentorship when it comes to these areas, the majority of our companies, they do have these programs, but not as many as before. And if you can believe it, the number of companies tracking the outcomes of their mentorship and sponsorships programs are declining. So we're offering the programs, but we're not actually investing the time in understanding who those programs are benefiting. That's a problem, especially for us. We all know that employee resource groups are a huge asset to our diversity and equity strategies, and the Latino one for us, right? We talked a lot about that yesterday in Jai's panel with our amazing ERG leaders. So we understand, I'm on the wrong slide, aren't I? Yes, all right, let's go back. Well, that being said, I'm gonna skip ahead because I need the time. Our ERG leaders are empowered and positioned to impact this change. There we go. And since the majority of our companies have them, it's really empowered, thank you, empowered for you, your position to raise that red flag, to pay attention to that data. One of the things that was on the slides I had to skip is that even though our numbers are decreasing in overall, our representation in non-exempt positions is increasing. 70% of Hispanics in corporate America are in non-exempt positions. That is critical data point. Why? Because non-exempt positions are more distanced from the typical traditional advancement strategies that we use in corporate America to reach the C-suite, to meet those executive positions. Are your executive programs, are your development programs, are your mentorship and sponsorship programs accessible to your non-exempt employees? Well, if they're not, the chances are that they're also not accessible to the majority of your Hispanic employees. that's a problem. I do promise there's a little bit of good news in here too. Okay. Moving on to procurement. Quite quickly, I'm trying. Procurement is the area where we have a little bit of good news, right? Where we actually saw an increase in the percentage of total procurement spend that's going to Hispanics. It increased from last year to 2%. That is a decrease from pre-pandemic levels, but it is going in the right direction. So that's something to acknowledge. We do know, however, that tracking the number of suppliers in that spend is equally important. You could have one Hispanic supplier getting all $2 billion. That'd be a very lucky company, right? But it could be, or you could have 50, 100 Hispanic suppliers, depending on where your company, what your company's goal is around equity, and we heard a lot about equity today. You want to pay attention to what the number of Hispanic suppliers are and your total supplier count, not just your diverse count, your total supplier count. And that will help you understand what your impacts around your equity goals are through your procurement strategies. The other area of opportunity here in procurement is calculating and partnering with your vendors around tier 2 and tier 3 procurement data. This data is not usually required. It is usually structured in a partnership with your vendor companies. This is about shared meaning, shared definitions, transparency with your partners, and really utilizing your network of vendors as advocates for procurement, advocates for direct investments in Hispanic businesses and communities. If you're doing that, you're able to tell your story a lot differently as a company. Even if you're really challenged in your tier 1, we understand that there are some systemic and structural barriers to inclusion at the tier 1 level. Let's not stop there. Let's not get hung up with those tier 1 barriers. While we work on those, and I'll emphasize the while, you can also be working on the data collection and partnerships and advocacy through your tier 2 and tier 3 network of vendors. Philanthropy, our third pillar in our inclusion report. Similar to procurement, data transparency is key to understanding the impact of your philanthropy work. And for our corporate inclusion index, philanthropy includes both your corporate giving and your corporate foundation. We do a lot of data collection as well around volunteering and in-kind data, in-kind donations of services or goods to Hispanic communities. We also know that while the majority of companies share their total numbers in their corporate and foundation giving, significantly less number of companies are actually able to offer or willing to offer that disaggregated look. And we know that it's the disaggregated look at the data that tells you what's actually happening for us. Are these dollars reaching our Hispanic communities? Are these dollars reaching the issues, the social issues and causes that are affecting our Hispanic communities? Those are big questions. But without that disaggregated look, we actually cannot give you a solid answer. It's on us to think about ways to share that data differently, to ask your evaluation questions differently through your corporate giving programs. So high-level data here. For both corporate and foundation giving, philanthropic investment totals are lower than they were in 2019. All right. There's some variation from year to year, but in terms of have we at least reached, never mind exceeded our pre-pandemic levels? We have not. It's a point to take home. We have decreased the percent of investment that is going to Hispanic communities through our philanthropic investments has decreased as well. And then, as I mentioned, in-kind and volunteer giving is important, but the data collection on that is really, frankly, inconsistent. Or how companies track it, how reliably they track it, where they get it from, needs some work. And so I encourage you to think about how you can create shared meaning and shared definitions in your companies around that particular area of work so that your data, you can actually understand some year-to-year tracking from that data. For example, I would share, while 94% of this year's participating companies report that their volunteer programs are supported by management, 89% reported that their programs are integrated with other business functions, all great. Only 65% are actually tracking and evaluating the impact of those volunteer efforts on employees and communities. So it has all the support, but we don't know if it's working. In our governance pillar, you'll see here that HACR really focuses on board level inclusion, Hispanics on corporate boards. We focus on Hispanic inclusion at the top tier of management. There's 3 levels of management under the CEO. This is what we call our executive leadership pipeline. And as you can see here from the board, it has decreased. In fact, we know that if you're looking at that C-suite number, if you just look at the Class A, which really is defined as the people who report directly to the CEO. I don't call it the C-suite, it's Class A because it could be some variation there. But based on these numbers of 0.56% inclusion of Hispanics, 0.56, that translates into roughly 50% chance that your CEO does not have an Hispanic voice in his or her closest network of advisors. Where are we? Why aren't we there? These are really big questions. Exempt employees are the primary pool of talent for this level of leadership. And while the number of Hispanics have increased, our percentage of representation in this pool has decreased by 1%. So now that this year's data, we are represented at 7.6% when you look at Class A, Class B, and Class C executives combined. I have to rush it up. All of this are examples of why that non-exempt and exempt category is really important. If we know that our level of representation is decreasing in these executive positions, we know that the talent from these executive positions is coming from exempt pools, most likely, but we are overrepresented in non-exempt pools. There's a disconnect, and there's some barriers that we're going to need to address. And then, as I mentioned, we do a special look at the Latina experience. HACR has invested. We have our Latina Empower Her initiative strategy. We have our LES conference in March, which is specific to Latina experience, and we have the data that goes along with it. And what I could share here is that there's not that much change, right? That Latina representation on corporate boards has changed little. We're at about 1.8% in this year's data. And that Latina representation around corporate executives has also remained relatively flat. So while it's not decreasing, which is always good, it's also not really increasing at the pace of change that's going to help this specific community reach parity in the workforce. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I hope you guys are taking notes. I don't want you to be overwhelmed. This is empowering. There's a lot to do. We will do this together, but there is a lot. The percentage of non-exempt positions held by Latinas, that's non-exempt, I'll say that again, increased from 8.27 to 12.27%. That's an increase of 4% in this year's data. Again, thinking about if we're overrepresented in non-exempt positions, how are we going to get into that executive leadership pipeline? All right. But positive, Latinas did represent over 1/5 of Hispanic suppliers reported in this year's report, even though they represent less than 1% of all total suppliers. So, with that, I'll leave you with this before we go into our panel. Is the so what here? Why? Why did I spend so much time going through this data? And why do I spend so much time finishing this report every year? Why do I want you all to read it when it is released? Because we need to focus on the opportunity of now. Now is when companies are open to change. Now is when your strategy teams and your business units are looking at new ways to avoid the disruptions of the future. What did we learn from the last 2 years, and how are we not going to experience that? Well, let's make sure that we're asking those same questions about our DE&I work, and let's make sure we're drilling down to the Hispanic experience within that lens. That is the opportunity here, that when we define that new normal, when we sit here and we look at our colleagues and say, what does it mean to re-normalize our work? We have to also challenge, what are the processes that we don't want to bring forward, we don't want to carry with us from the past? What are those status quo norms that need to stay behind? And where's the opportunity to create something different? I ask that question of you. It's not my question. I don't have the answer. But if you share your data, I can give you a lens. And we can be your partner in advocating for that change. We can re-envision this together, but it really is up to us. So thank you. So that did take a little bit longer than expected, but we do have an amazing panel here to help share some of their experiences as key partners of our Corporate Inclusion Index. And so if you'd help me in welcoming both our panelists to the stage. We have Juan Ortero, who is the Senior Vice President at Comcast NBC Universal. Thank you, sorry, thank you. And we have Betty Enriquez, who is our Inclusion and Diversity Lead in the Office of Inclusion and Diversity at Humana. Thank you both for coming on stage today. So I know it was a lot of information, and so I'm just gonna jump in with a quick surprise, right? What's your reaction to some of the data that I shared today? How are you feeling?
So it's a little shocking, but at the same time, it's not, right? Because we already know this. As DEI practitioners, we have seen this data, and we know that there is still a lot of opportunity. So there's a lot of opportunity within our Latino community, but it also provides hope. So to your comment earlier, we know that there are, I take advantage of the report. I read the 60+ page report to get some good insights on what are those things that maybe we need to sunset? What are those things that aren't working for us? And where do we need to focus? Because also as DEI practitioners, we get exhausted. This is exhausting work. So with that, I'll also say that just being here and taking part of yesterday really inspired me and re-energized me.
Good, I'm glad to hear.
So it was great to just be back on, really just traveling and being with other Latino professionals in, this type of environment. So thank you for that. You did that, you re-energized me, so thank you.
Thank you for that. Juan.
I am surprised and I'm empowered by it. I spent a lot of time looking at these data, looking at our internal benchmarking against other companies. So I guess I should say I'm not surprised seeing the trend lines where they are. There's so much upheaval right now in corporate America and society writ large. That's a whole separate panel. But with that upheaval, I think there's winds of change. One of the things that that are driving these conversations, activists, investors, activists, employees. So it's a different world than we were 2.5 years ago. So I'm not surprised by the data, but I am empowered by it because that report will go to every senior executive when I get back and make sure everyone sees that. We do a debrief. Everyone's going to have to sit and listen. And as my colleagues point on being exhausted, being that Latino voice and having to shed light on why are these deltas here. And now we've got this national trend line, and we're a super competitive company. So we damn well better not be in that in that section. So it's one of those things that this report is just, I hate to say I'm weaponizing it, but I'm going to use it as a weapon.
Yeah, so I will share with the audience, Comcast and Humana are longtime stakeholders in our Corporate Inclusion Index. Comcast NBC Universal has been a 14-year partner in this benchmarking initiative. And Humana has 11 years, not too far behind. So first, thank you both. In light of what you can do with it, I want to have a little reflection on why this benchmarking initiative is so important and why your companies have really invested in the disaggregation of data that's needed to fully optimize our Corporate Inclusion Index.
Happy to jump in on that. Again, I gave you a little window into my soul about how I weaponize things. But it's uniquely Latino. And as we do our surveys, we do look for best in class. So thank you, and thank Sid and Sarah and all of the people who came before me that have been partnering with this organization, because I want to see that uniquely Latino snapshot. There's some amazing instruments out there, but to your very astute point about aggregation, when you disaggregate, that's when you get the real story. And I see a lot of D&I reports, and I'm not going to throw shade and name people, but the reality is it's a forced multiplier for positive results when you aggregate into totality. But it really is about how do you have more disaggregated data. If there's any trend line that I want, that I've been leading in the company, is how do we pull apart even further? Because we have to get to the real story.
Yeah, and I would agree. So we have a very similar story at Humana, and we, like many other companies, participate in all these various benchmarking surveys, right? And some are general, some are a little more specific. Again, I said the Corporate Inclusion Index is very, very specific to our community. It tells us what we need to do, where are those opportunities, where are we doing good, where are we doing well, that's always nice to see, but for me, it's where can we continue to move the needle?
Yeah.
And within Humana, I've been with Humana for 16 years, so a very, very long time. And initially, we would look at some of our data from a people of color, non-people of color perspective. Very general, right? And I'll just give an example. When we used to look at our data this way, sometimes it was, we were looking at our hiring metrics. How are we doing with our people of color hiring versus our non-people of color hiring? And what we found also is that you have to continue to peel back that layer. So if we were looking at these hiring statistics, what we found as we peeled back those layers were some of the groups were really pushing the numbers forward, while other groups were being left behind. And Latinos, specifically being part of that group. So now we're able to specifically look at not just people of color, but how is our Black community doing? How is our Hispanic Latino community doing? And every other sub-community. And then of course, also look at Hispanic men versus Hispanic women, and that's very rich data.
It is. So, you mentioned sharing this with your entire executive leadership team, and you were mentioning, the process of peeling back. And in order to even invest in that process, you have to have buy-in. You have to have leadership buy-in. And, the responsibility for DE&I, as we heard earlier today, is everybody's in some, right? So this is a very integrated process of pulling that data and putting it to action. Can you speak a little bit about how your company builds leadership buy-in around these benchmarking initiatives, maybe specifically around the CII, but really any of them, and how do you organize the collection of data to make sure that you're getting the view that you need?
Happy to jump in. Well, I'll tell you, we just are on the heels of our External Diversity Committee, where our CEO spent a lot of time. We have a group of stakeholders that come in under NDA. So they see everything that we see, unvarnished. Those can be really enjoyable meetings, and those can be very tough meetings. But part of our rigor is having that validator. HACR is a validator. And look, we are in a unique position. Sylvia and I were talking about how D&I is structured at Comcast Corporation. Well, we have a corporate function that has access to all the data systems. So there is no hiding from me. So whether it's procurement, CI, everything, we've got a group of about 10 people that are sitting there looking at this. So it's a unique position, it's a different kind of model. And what's new and different in the last 2 years is this embed away from sort of the top down, while we have that buy-in, but putting in strategically in our cable, NBC, people who are at the CEO level, our various division CEOs, who are accountable for DE&I, who then report up to corporate. So it's that kind of rigor and thinking differently to move things forward.
Right.
Yeah, and we've got a very similar model too. So within Humana, we have refreshed our executive I&D council. And what that means is that before, pre this, refresh, it was a lot of our MT leaders. So those are the individuals that report directly to Bruce. But since this refresh, we've also been able to bring some of our frontline associates into the council. Yeah. So you have these executive leaders who we've told you've got to leave your title at the front door. When you come into this room, when you come into these meetings, you're just like any other associate. And our other associates have every opportunity to voice their concerns as well. They tell us what the Humana streets are saying. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes when you're at that C-suite, when you're at that management team level, you don't hear what, in our case, the Humana streets are saying. So they are able to bring that voice of the associate up, and they're able to really hold our leaders accountable and really help us lead and identify where are those strategic initiatives, what should those strategic initiatives be, what should they be, and how do we need to focus?
Yeah. So we have I'm sure you guys do also the sort of pulse checks with the employees, and you've got these surveys. One of the things that I'm perennially challenged by is looking at the Latino numbers in terms of employee satisfaction, because we over-index in very high, love the company, love what they're doing in DEI, love this, all of the programs and so forth. But then I have the water cooler conversation and say, what's happening? Like, hey, so I don't know, and I don't believe in cultural determinism, but I do wonder at times whether, we look at these surveys and just think we want to show up, right? But there's a disconnect, because I do have my tribe of folks that I pull out and say, tell me what you really think. What did you think about that announcement? What do you think about that contract that we just gave? And there seems to be a disconnect, and I'm talking to colleagues in sister companies, they're feeling the same thing. So I'm not sure, there's something, and I can't name it, something funky about what's going on in the database. That's a term of art, funky. But seems to be a disconnect, and I just wanted to have that call out too.
Thank you. And I do use that term funky
Yes,
regularly.
please feel free.
Just so you know. So I want to do a little bit of storytelling, if you don't mind. And could you share a time when you specifically used the Corporate Inclusion Index data to drive a strategic debate at your companies? And how did that come up? If you want to, what data point it was, if that's relevant. But really tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so I'm happy to share first. And again, like I said, this is a document that I read every single year. I'm super excited about the fact that this is going to have 3 years just of work into it. So everybody, if you do get an opportunity, obviously take a moment to read through that information. I will tell you one of our takeaways about 2 years ago was really around the intern population. So we know how we rated as an organization. We also know how the HACR community rated as an organization, right? So if we look at 2021, I believe it was 12% from an intern perspective, was really focused on Hispanic Latinos. But then it really got me thinking about the larger picture. 12% is probably a little better than what we're doing at Humana, but from a Latino population, we know that we make up 19% of the community. So again, a little discouraging. And then when you think about the Gen Z population, generation, the people that are coming in, we all know that 1 of every 4, 25% of Gen Zers identify as Hispanic Latino.
That's right.
So again, that was eye-opening to me. It was eye-opening knowing where we as an organization, where we stood, and it really activated our team. That was not one of the focus areas that we really paid attention to. So we typically will pay attention at the shifts and the changes happening within senior management and above. Again, that shifted our thinking. It got us thinking about what's happening in that early career pipeline and what can we do to specifically focus and target our Latino students.
So a couple of pieces that I've used the report on. One, disaggregation. When we look at the totality of the circumstances for Latino populations, we have this amazing entity called Telemundo, right? Looking at it from an NBC perspective, numbers are good, but what I did not want to have was this very lovely gated entity increasing numbers, artificially pushing up. So we constantly will pull out from that. And it really does help to have that sort of separate piece. I think probably the biggest takeaway for me is the mentorship. There's a lot of mentoring going on in the company, but is it systematized? Is it organized? So we're under this journey right now. Again, COVID slowed us up a little bit of how are we pulling this apart and really using the tools we have right now, whether it's a Workday tool, so something that we have readily available to understand how are we doing this in a systematic way so we can report out. And we use this report as an example of a place where we have real opportunity. Again, it's not that it's not going on, but I want to see progress for that pipeline, for all of the other issues that we are putting in place to make sure the numbers don't stay the same, but rather move forward. It's a key part.
Absolutely. I would even take it a little step further to say I consider this the low-hanging fruit in particular, those tracking mentorship and sponsorship opportunities. So many of our companies have them. They are really core, kind of cornerstone components of our leadership development pipelines, both at early career and executive level at some, right?
Yeah.
But if we're not tracking them, then we don't know, we don't have the data to point to, we don't have the data to drive the conversation that says, you know, our Latinos, we're not in these programs. Or we're not benefiting in the same way. You know, I have a mentor, but my mentor is not doing for me what Charles's mentor is doing for him.
Yeah.
Right? So how do I get to that view? And I really think that that's, you know, with all the programs in place, it's just asking the different question and sticking with it, right? I think a large part of the data is that shared definition that crosses across business units, and that helps everybody speak the same language, and we're all looking for the same data point.
And it's directly related to the pipeline issue. So if these folks are not in the right programs, they're not in the right rooms, well, you know, when you get to that who is going to get promoted conversations, especially as we go from a position of abundance to almost austerity, you know, whether we're in a recession or not. But again, I think that's an implicative factor that we all need to think through. That has to be even more pointed because companies are all tightening their belts.
That's right. So let's, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to add just one quick point there. So one of the modifications in Humana, we've had a formal sponsorship program for many years. And I think like any organization, you have to constantly see what opportunities can we shift from the sponsorship program. And one of the things that we saw, so we were able to pair our proteges with a sponsor. Sometimes it was based, so we got their feedback on tell me where it is you want to go, where are you looking to go, or tell me about leaders you admire. That's great. So one of the additional pieces that we are folding into this process now is a business line sponsor. So you talked about succession planning, talent reviews, and that other sponsor, the original sponsor, may not be in the room for succession planning, may not be in the room for talent reviews, but this business aligned sponsor will now serve as somebody who will also be in the room, who will be able to speak up for Juan, for Sylvia, for, you know, for any individual, and really showcase that talent. Because we also know that as Latinos, we don't like to toot our own horns, right? It is very, very hard. It's hard for me. So being able to really leverage those opportunities such as sponsorship, we believe have really shifted and made progress within our organization.
Yeah, I like to call it the broken rung theory. Like literally, if that ladder is broken at the bottom, you're not going to be able to climb up.
That's right. You can't skip step. There's no skipping in this journey, right? So if I do a parallel structure, you know, we talked a little bit about internships and how important representation of Latinos are in that specific area of work, among many others. Looking in procurement, it's an area of opportunity for companies as well. Those supplier development initiatives serve the same type of function for procurement, for your supply chains, where you have an internship type opportunity for your vendors, an opportunity to get to know your company, to understand what you want, to have assistance and help in meeting the criteria. It's another low-hanging piece of fruit. Could you speak a little bit about, you know, how your company approaches that particular strategy within its procurement and efforts to diversify the vendor supply chain?
Yeah, so you talked, you know, exactly our language. And at Humana in 2019, what we did is we launched a mentor protege program. And what that allowed is opportunities for these diverse suppliers. And when we talk about diverse, yes, we're talking about, you know, the racial and ethnic diversity, but we're also talking about female diversity. We're talking about LGBTQ+, and all these other communities. And it was important for us to really help some of these organizations that we started in Louisville, so locally in Louisville, who would have the opportunity to come inside Humana's four walls and really learn with, you know, from a mentor And that mentor would showcase them and help them understand what does it take to have an actual shot at winning a bid with Humana. What are leaders looking for? And really working with some of our tier 2 providers as well, suppliers, because that's also a great opportunity. So we've got our tier 1, Humana, but then also what can we do to bring up some of those tier 2 suppliers and ensure that they know what it takes to have an actual shot at competing for Humana's business.
Very similar structure. We've had a robust procurement team that focuses only on diverse suppliers for over 10 years. But it is that kind of commitment. It is that kind of intentionality to work with even so the bigger companies, like we buy big stuff. So it's the tier 1, tier 2, but have we looked at tier 3? I mean, that's always a challenge, but how do you use your market size to bring folks together, bring different vendors together? That's something that we're constantly going on. I'm super proud of that team, and they've done great work.
Thank you. So both of your companies have very high ratings and excellence for our Corporate Inclusion Index, correct? But we also know that the journey is still ongoing. So how do you balance that message internally with your stakeholders that we did great and we're being recognized, but we still have more to do? Where does that balance come in for you as leaders?
So that goes to my weaponization theory of in January, I'm very grumpy because I call it the survey season, and I have everybody together, and I'm like, yes, it's me again, and and this is what we're going to prioritize, and this is what we're going to do. But it's the after effect. Like when we get these results, we will do a deep dive on everything, and then look to those points, mentoring, procurement, what have you, of places where we have opportunity and where we need to lean in on.
Yeah, and very similar at Humana. So we do take advantage of just everything that ASED offers. One of the things that we've been able to do as well is we know, again, same like you, that first quarter is going to be busy, right? We're having to do Diversity Inc. We're having to do ASED. We're having to do all these
No
other
one wants to be around me that first quarter.
Yes,
literally.
yes. But again, we've also been able to work with our human capital analytics and just anticipate, not perfect, but anticipate some of the questions that we're going to be getting. And it takes a lot of time for us to get that data. So being able to start early, we just got an email from somebody in that department saying, I'm prepping for the 2022 benchmarking surveys. What's the information that you anticipate? So it's exciting to see that they're ready and on board to start getting some of that information, and it's not us always having to hound them for the information for that entire 2 to 3 month period.
Well, I'll just say our email's coming out next month, so make sure you pass it around.
And I will tell you that there's such an interest from the ESG community about these types of benchmarking studies. I spend more time with the investor relations team, folks that are being inquisitive about where are we with this. Our board is now a permanent action item on our board of directors. I don't see visiting with the board as a career building opportunity necessarily, because they're a very tough board and they're very smart and very inquisitive. But it's these kinds of tools that help empower folks like us to be able to make that case. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. And on my last question in the last minutes, we'll do rapid fire before we open up to Q&A, is when you think about our CII data and you think about what I'm calling the status quo traps that companies have to avoid as they try to recalibrate for these new norms, what's the data that you think is going to help your company skip over those steps, help avoid that mistake and move you into the future where you really want to be for Hispanics?
I'll tell you that's tough for us. So we are still, I think I heard you say this backstage, you don't have an answer, we don't have an answer. So we are still working on what does that mean for us? But again, just being hopeful of the progress that we want to make as an organization, being hopeful of, what do we look like? Why are we important? And why does this need to be a priority within our organization?
It's a tough question.
Sorry.
Because it's not for a lack of thinking, but it is. I mean, certainly off the top of my head, I think, what were the lessons from COVID? How can we use remote work to, we've got a huge division in New Hampshire that there's a lot of opportunity for, better representation. How can we use that remote work tool to create that atmosphere where you can plug people in from wherever? As I think we're all trying to figure out what RTO means. That would be, I think, a big loss if we did not be very thoughtful how this could really help DE&I along in places that are geographically, regionally challenged just by their lack of diversity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
And I'll just add very quickly, I know we're out of time, but somebody had mentioned too earlier the transparency piece, and we have seen that. We have associates who have, since all the social unrest, and certainly we had our fair share of events in our own backyard, right, in Louisville, Kentucky. And it's the transparency that is being demanded of us as an organization, from our associates, from our communities. They want to know what we're doing to move the needle, and we have that responsibility to also communicate to them, both internally and externally.
Yeah, we do. That communication is key, and as we heard earlier, more people are asking, right? So with that, we will open up this conversation to you. And this time, I'm going to start with our virtual audience to make sure that we tap into you and your questions as well. So who has the question from the audience?
I have the virtual question. We all strive for diverse panels. How should organizations that have limited pools of diverse talent in parts of their business approach diverse panels? I see that the same diverse talent gets tapped to sit on panels for various roles.
That is a real, legitimate issue of, and it has caused, consternation of folks that are just, how many times am I going to sit on these? From an interview standpoint, someone being interviewed, an interviewee standpoint. So it is about how do you, how do you really address? I don't profess to have that answer, but it is one of those things where we're trying to think out what is the right approach in terms of those panels, because it's exhausting, and just in terms of people that are being put forth for positions. And again, I won't throw shade, but there has been, very public companies that have been called asunder for having this practice of saying we're going to have all of these interviews, but you weren't really up for the job. So, companies need to be thoughtful. They need to think about their material liability in this kind of space, and that is something that, again, something that needs to be worked through.
Yeah, and I would agree. This is something that we've implemented at Humana. We refer to them as balanced interview panels, right? So we want to make sure that we have balance on our panels. And I would say that I'm also, so I often get tapped on the shoulder to be on this interview panel and that interview panel. And there are so many other conflicting priorities. There's so many other things that we're working on. But I also feel that it is my responsibility to continue to be part of that interview panel and bring that different perspective that we often don't have on those panels when it comes to these candidates too. So we don't have the answer fully baked, but we do encourage, take advantage of our NRG leadership too. That is a great pool of individuals that we can leverage for some of these diverse interview panels.
Yeah. My cautionary tale in all of that is that we can't fall into the trap of performative DE&I and having panels for the sake of having panels.
Yes.
And that is my perennial question. Like, is this candidate legit? Are we really doing this, or are we checking the box? There's a real existential question in my mind about targets set, because then I think you fall into that trap, and people will try to, not all people, I should say, but some folks will be performative, and that is when the train goes off the rails.
Juan, I'm wondering, how are you using artificial intelligence and gamification to drive impact in your organization?
So it's a fascinating, and I'm not a techno-alarmist or a techno-purist, but question on the exempt employees, non-exempt, it is it's something that, as we see, it's not coming. We're all tech companies. We're all here. We're all using these analytics. My nirvana with AI is really to get to a point where we can have predictive analytics in terms of trend lines. I'm perennially challenged by, the algorithm. I'm perennially challenged about, is this really going to get us to the best place? There's some good work being done out there, to be truthful, but I have healthy skepticism right now about what those tools can necessarily bring and what they're going to show out. So it's certainly, as we're trying to think of not the future of AI, the implementation of what we're having is, how can we use those tools? How can we do them thoughtfully? And how can they not be unbiased? Mm-hmm. And that's really the key.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Juan Diaz from Ecolab. And I guess my question is around ERG leaders, right? As you get access to all of this data, right, and you're moving and trying to move away from that affinity group and actually play a bigger role on it, right? And you're thinking about the disaggregation of the data and that you have a closer feel of what's happening on, with the employees, right, with your membership. How can you take a more active role, right, of going back and maybe challenging, right, or maybe asking for a little bit more transparency around the data, right? And it's not just something of like, well, throw the event for Dia de los Muertos or do this or do that, but, actually take a bigger role on that recruiting or, hey, what's the data? What is it that we're doing, right? Instead of just that activity that you're taking, but how do you approach it to be a bigger voice in that conversation? I wonder if you guys have any advice.
Yeah, I love that, Juan. And what I'll tell you is, and I met Juan last night, and he's amazing. He's amazing. And what I'll tell you is that I actually challenge our NRGs, and specifically our Latino Hispanic NRG, to ask us those questions. Ask us for the data. We want our ERGs, they're not fully BRGs yet, but we want them to make that transition. But we also, going back to transparency, as an organization, as the Office of I&D, you can't just hoard the information within your small wall. We have to be willing to share that. We're not going to share specific associate details, right? Like these are the details for Juan, but we are going to share what does that picture look like for the NRG? What are the opportunities that the NRG can help move some of these levers as well when it comes to recruiting and development and advancing? And that's a big piece that we are also working on at Humana. So it's not just about retaining and it's not just about hiring, but how do we actually help our associates progress, make those career pathways available for our non-exempt associates who often in our situation are in those call center type jobs. They don't have the opportunity to participate in as often. How do we create those opportunities for them to move into different parts of the organization, to take part of maybe an apprenticeship where it would be for our internal talent, and they can reskill and upskill based on where we will go in the future.
And I would just add one, just from the CII's perspective, that we really design our survey to be a roadmap for leaders like you who are asking that question, how do I do this and where do I start? And there are a lot of tips on what that path can look like. So for example, around ERG specifically, we recommend, do you have an executive sponsor? Because sure enough, you have an executive sponsor's name, it's tied to your ERG leadership, you're going to be doing something meaningful to the company, right? Are you engaged in recruitment? Are you engaged in procurement? Right, that's another area, right? Your ERG engagement integration is really limitless, right? But we do offer a kind of those, if you're going to start somewhere, start here as tips for you for success. We are out of time. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you especially to our panelists. Thank you so much for today's conversation. And I look forward to chatting with all of you about taking the CII next year. Thanks.